Welcome to Benel S. Matthew. Let us straight away go to our topic about climate change. Climate change is a significant and pressing global issue that affects the environment, the economy, and society as a whole. It is caused by the emission of greenhouse gases, primarily carbon dioxide, into the atmosphere from human activities such as burning fossil fuels, deforestation, and agriculture. These gases trap heat in the atmosphere, leading to an increase in global temperatures, changes in weather patterns, and a rise in sea levels. The effects of climate change are widespread and include more frequent and severe weather events, such as heat waves, droughts, and floods, which can result in the loss of homes, businesses, and lives. Climate change also has an impact on agriculture and food production, leading to decreased yields and food shortages in some parts of the world. Additionally, climate change is a significant threat to biodiversity, as rising temperatures and changing weather patterns can lead to the loss of habitats and extinction of species. To address the issue of climate change, countries around the world have taken steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and transition to renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, was established in 1992 to address climate change on a global scale. The Paris Agreement, which was signed in 2015 by 195 countries, aims to keep the global temperature rise below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and to pursue efforts to limit it to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Individual actions can also make a significant difference in addressing climate change. Reducing energy consumption by turning off lights and appliances when not in use, using public transportation or carpooling, and eating a plant-based diet are just a few ways individuals can reduce their carbon footprint. In addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, adaptation measures are also necessary to address the impacts of climate change that are already being felt. These include measures such as building seawalls and flood barriers, improving water management, and developing drought-resistant crops. There are many challenges to addressing climate change, including political barriers, economic factors, and social issues. However, by working together and taking collective action, we can mitigate the impacts of climate change and create a sustainable future for generations to come. To further address climate change, it's important to understand the science behind it. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, the Earth's temperature has increased by approximately 1.1 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. The IPCC also notes that greenhouse gas emissions need to be reduced by 45% by 2030 and reach net zero by 2050 to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This requires a rapid and large-scale transition to renewable energy sources, as well as the implementation of policies and measures to reduce emissions across all sectors. Another challenge in addressing climate change is the need for international cooperation. Climate change is a global issue that requires a global response. This requires countries to work together to implement policies and measures to reduce emissions, as well as to provide support to developing countries that are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. In addition to mitigation and adaptation measures, there is also a need for education and public awareness about climate change. This includes raising awareness about the impacts of climate change and the importance of reducing emissions, as well as encouraging individuals and communities to take action. Finally, it's important to recognize that addressing climate change is not just an environmental issue, but also a social and economic issue. The transition to a low-carbon economy can create new opportunities for jobs and economic growth, while also promoting social equity and reducing poverty. In conclusion, climate change is a complex and urgent global issue that requires collective action and cooperation from all sectors of society. By reducing greenhouse gas emissions, implementing adaptation measures, and raising awareness about the impacts of climate change, we can create a sustainable future for ourselves and future generations. To further delve into the issue of climate change, it's important to understand the role of various sectors in contributing to greenhouse gas emissions. One major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions is the energy sector, which includes the burning of fossil fuels for electricity and transportation. In order to transition to a low-carbon economy, it's important to increase the use of renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, and hydropower. This requires the development of new technologies and infrastructure to support the integration of renewable energy sources into the grid.
Another sector that contributes to greenhouse gas emissions is agriculture and forestry. Deforestation and land use changes can lead to the loss of carbon sinks, which are areas that absorb carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Additionally, agriculture and livestock production can lead to emissions of methane and nitrous oxide, which are potent greenhouse gases. To address these issues, sustainable land use practices and the reduction of meat consumption can be effective in reducing emissions. The transportation sector is also a major contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to transitioning to electric or hybrid vehicles, promoting alternative forms of transportation such as public transit, biking, and walking can reduce emissions from transportation. Urban planning and development can also play a role in reducing transportation emissions by promoting compact, walkable communities and reducing the need for long commutes. Finally, the industrial sector is also a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. This includes emissions from manufacturing, construction, and the production of cement and steel. To reduce emissions from industry, it's important to improve energy efficiency and promote the use of renewable energy sources in manufacturing and construction processes. In addition to these sectors, there are also opportunities to address emissions from buildings, waste management, and the aviation and shipping sectors. By taking a holistic approach and addressing emissions across all sectors, we can effectively mitigate the impacts of climate change and transition to a sustainable future. It's also important to consider the ethical implications of climate change. Developing countries are often the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, despite contributing the least to greenhouse gas emissions. As such, there is a need for developed countries to provide support to developing countries in addressing climate change and adapting to its impacts. In addition to international cooperation, addressing climate change also requires individual action. This includes reducing energy consumption, using public transportation or carpooling, eating a plant-based diet, and supporting policies and measures that promote the transition to a low-carbon economy. In conclusion, climate change is a complex and urgent issue that requires collective action and cooperation from all sectors of society. By addressing emissions across all sectors and promoting international cooperation and individual action, we can effectively mitigate the impacts of climate change and create a sustainable future. In addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, it's also important to consider the impacts of climate change and the need for adaptation measures. Climate change is already causing significant impacts on ecosystems, water resources, food security, and human health. These impacts are particularly felt by vulnerable populations such as low-income communities, indigenous peoples, and coastal communities. To address these impacts, it's important to implement adaptation measures that build resilience to the impacts of climate change. This includes improving water management and infrastructure, developing drought-resistant crops, and improving early warning systems for extreme weather events. It's also important to recognize the role of ecosystems in providing natural protection against climate impacts, such as wetlands and forests. Additionally, there is a need to address the social and economic impacts of climate change. Climate change can lead to displacement of people, loss of livelihoods, and increased poverty. Adaptation measures must be inclusive and equitable, taking into account the needs of vulnerable communities and promoting social and economic resilience. The transition to a low-carbon economy can also provide opportunities for job creation and economic growth, particularly in the renewable energy sector. However, it's important to ensure that these opportunities are accessible to all and do not perpetuate social and economic inequalities. Finally, it's important to recognize that addressing climate change requires a long-term perspective and sustained action. The impacts of climate change will continue to be felt for decades to come, even if greenhouse gas emissions are reduced. As such, there is a need for ongoing research, monitoring, and adaptive management to address the impacts of climate change and promote a sustainable future. In conclusion, addressing climate change requires a comprehensive approach that considers the science, the impacts, and the need for adaptation measures. By reducing greenhouse gas emissions, promoting adaptation measures, and addressing the social and economic impacts of climate change, we can create a sustainable future for ourselves and future generations. One of the biggest challenges in addressing climate change is the need for collective action and international cooperation.
Climate change is a global issue that requires a coordinated effort from all countries to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate its impacts. This has led to the development of international agreements such as the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, and the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement, which was adopted in 2015, is a legally binding agreement between 197 countries to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursue efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The agreement also includes provisions for supporting developing countries in addressing climate change and adapting to its impacts. However, despite the efforts of the international community, progress in reducing greenhouse gas emissions has been slow. Many countries continue to rely on fossil fuels for energy and transportation, and the transition to a low-carbon economy requires significant investment and political will. The impacts of climate change, such as extreme weather events and sea level rise, are also becoming more pronounced, highlighting the urgent need for action. In addition to international cooperation, addressing climate change also requires leadership and action at the local level. Cities and local governments play a crucial role in implementing policies and measures to reduce emissions and promote sustainable development.
Many cities have set ambitious targets to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and are investing in renewable energy and sustainable transportation.
Individual action is also important in addressing climate change. By reducing energy consumption, using public transportation or carpooling, eating a plant-based diet, and supporting policies and measures that promote the transition to a low-carbon economy, individuals can make a significant impact in reducing greenhouse gas emissions. In conclusion, addressing climate change requires a comprehensive approach that includes international cooperation, local leadership, and individual action. The transition to a low-carbon economy requires significant investment and political will, but the impacts of climate change demand urgent action. By working together and taking action at all levels, we can create a sustainable future for ourselves and future generations. One of the challenges in addressing climate change is the role of fossil fuels in the global economy. Fossil fuels, such as coal, oil, and gas, are the primary source of energy for most of the world's economies. However, the burning of fossil fuels releases greenhouse gases that contribute to climate change. The transition to a low-carbon economy requires a shift away from fossil fuels and towards renewable energy sources such as wind, solar, and hydropower. The shift towards renewable energy sources has already begun, with significant growth in the renewable energy sector in recent years. Renewable energy is becoming increasingly competitive with fossil fuels, and many countries have set targets to increase their share of renewable energy in their energy mix. In addition, advances in technology have made renewable energy more efficient and cost-effective. However, the transition to a low-carbon economy requires more than just replacing fossil fuels with renewable energy sources. It also requires changes in our energy consumption patterns, such as reducing energy consumption and improving energy efficiency. This can be achieved through measures such as improving building codes and standards, promoting energy-efficient appliances, and investing in public transportation. Another important aspect of the transition to a low-carbon economy is the need for carbon pricing. Carbon pricing, which involves putting a price on greenhouse gas emissions, can provide a market signal that encourages the shift towards low-carbon technologies and practices. Carbon pricing can take the form of a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade system. In addition to reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the transition to a low-carbon economy can also provide economic benefits. The renewable energy sector has the potential to create new jobs and spur economic growth, particularly in developing countries. By investing in renewable energy, countries can also reduce their dependence on fossil fuel imports and improve their energy security. The transition to a low-carbon economy is a complex challenge that requires a comprehensive approach. This includes shifting towards renewable energy sources, improving energy efficiency, implementing carbon pricing, and promoting economic growth and job creation. The urgency of addressing climate change demands that we take action now to create a sustainable future for ourselves and future generations. Another challenge in addressing climate change is the need to adapt to its impacts. Even if greenhouse gas emissions were to be reduced to zero tomorrow, the climate would continue to change for decades or even centuries due to the accumulated effects of past emissions. This means that adaptation measures are necessary to help communities cope with the impacts of climate change. The impacts of climate change are already being felt around the world, with more frequent and severe extreme weather events such as heat waves, droughts, and floods. These events can have significant impacts on communities, including damage to infrastructure, loss of livelihoods, and displacement of people. Adaptation measures can help communities become more resilient to these impacts. Adaptation measures can take many forms, such as improving infrastructure to withstand extreme weather events, developing drought-resistant crops, and improving water management. In addition, measures such as early warning systems and insurance schemes can help communities prepare for and recover from extreme weather events. Adaptation measures are particularly important for developing countries, which are often more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change due to their limited resources and infrastructure. However, many developing countries lack the resources and capacity to implement effective adaptation measures. This highlights the need for international support to help these countries adapt to the impacts of climate change. In addition to adaptation, there is also a need for climate resilience. Climate resilience involves taking a long-term approach to planning and decision-making that takes into account the potential impacts of climate change. This can involve measures such as incorporating climate projections into infrastructure planning, improving water management, and promoting ecosystem-based approaches to adaptation.
In conclusion, adaptation and resilience are essential components of addressing climate change.
Even if greenhouse gas emissions were to be reduced to zero tomorrow, the impacts of climate change would continue to be felt for decades to come. By implementing adaptation and resilience measures, we can help communities become more resilient to these impacts and create a more sustainable future. This requires collective action and international cooperation, as well as leadership and action at the local level. Another important aspect of addressing climate change is the role of policy and governance. Governments play a critical role in implementing policies and regulations that can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote the transition to a low-carbon economy. This can include measures such as setting emissions reduction targets, implementing regulations on energy efficiency and emissions, and providing incentives for renewable energy adoption. One example of effective policy is the Paris Agreement, a global agreement signed by 196 countries in 2015 to combat climate change. The Paris Agreement aims to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to pursue efforts to limit warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Under the agreement, countries have pledged to submit their own nationally determined contributions, NDCs, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. In addition to national policies, there is also a need for local and regional action. Many cities and states around the world have set ambitious targets to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions, and are implementing policies and programs to achieve these targets. This can include measures such as promoting public transportation, improving energy efficiency in buildings, and investing in renewable energy. However, there are also challenges in implementing effective climate policies. One challenge is the need for international cooperation and coordination. Climate change is a global problem that requires a collective response, and countries must work together to address the issue. Another challenge is the need to balance environmental goals with economic and social priorities. The transition to a low-carbon economy can have economic impacts, and policies must be designed to minimize negative impacts on vulnerable communities and ensure a just transition for workers in the fossil fuel industry. There is also a need for public engagement and awareness raising. Climate change can be a complex and abstract issue, and it is important to educate the public on the impacts of climate change and the actions that can be taken to address it. This can involve measures such as public education campaigns, community engagement, and involving the public in decision-making processes. In conclusion, effective policy and governance are critical to addressing climate change. Governments at all levels have a role to play in implementing policies and regulations that can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote the transition to a low-carbon economy. This requires international cooperation and coordination, as well as engagement with the public and stakeholders. By taking action now, we can create a more sustainable future for ourselves and future generations. Another important aspect of addressing climate change is the role of technology and innovation. Advances in technology can play a critical role in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, improving energy efficiency, and promoting the transition to a low-carbon economy. This can include technologies such as renewable energy sources like wind and solar power, energy storage systems, and electric vehicles. One of the most important technologies in the fight against climate change is renewable energy. Renewable energy sources such as solar, wind, and hydropower do not emit greenhouse gases, and are becoming increasingly cost-competitive with traditional fossil fuels. In fact, the cost of solar and wind energy has decreased significantly in recent years, making them more accessible and affordable. Another important technology is energy storage. Energy storage systems can help address the intermittency of renewable energy sources such as wind and solar power, by storing excess energy during times of low demand and releasing it when demand is high. This can help make renewable energy more reliable and increase its penetration into the energy mix. Electric vehicles, EVs, are another important technology in the fight against climate change. EVs emit significantly less greenhouse gases than traditional gasoline-powered vehicles, and as renewable energy becomes more prevalent in the energy mix, the emissions associated with EVs will decrease even further. In addition, advances in battery technology are making EVs more affordable and increasing their range. In addition to these specific technologies, innovation more broadly can play a critical role in addressing climate change. New technologies and business models can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and improve energy efficiency in a wide range of sectors, from agriculture and manufacturing to transportation and construction. However, there are also challenges to implementing these technologies and fostering innovation. One challenge is the need for investment and financing. Many of these technologies require significant upfront investment, and financing can be difficult to secure. Governments and the private sector need to work together to provide the necessary investment and financing to accelerate the adoption of these technologies. Another challenge is the need for research and development. Many of these technologies are still in the early stages of development, and further research and development is needed to make them more efficient, cost-effective, and scalable. Governments and the private sector need to invest in research and development to ensure that these technologies can reach their full potential. In conclusion, technology and innovation are critical to addressing climate change. Advances in renewable energy, energy storage, electric vehicles, and other technologies can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote the transition to a low-carbon economy. However, investment, financing, and research and development are needed to accelerate the adoption and development of these technologies. By leveraging technology and innovation, we can create a more sustainable future for ourselves and future generations. Another important aspect of addressing climate change is the role of policy and governance. Governments play a critical role in setting targets and implementing policies that can help reduce greenhouse gas emissions and promote the transition to a low-carbon economy. This can include policies such as carbon pricing, renewable energy mandates, and energy efficiency standards. Carbon pricing is one of the most effective policies for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. By putting a price on carbon emissions, either through a carbon tax or a cap-and-trade system, companies and individuals are incentivized to reduce their emissions in order to avoid the cost of the carbon price. This can help drive investment in low-carbon technologies and promote the transition to a low-carbon economy. Renewable energy mandates are another important policy tool. These policies require utilities to generate a certain percentage of their electricity from renewable sources, such as wind or solar power. This can help increase the penetration of renewable energy in the energy mix and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Energy efficiency standards are also important for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. These standards can apply to appliances, buildings, and vehicles, and require them to meet certain energy efficiency requirements. This can help reduce energy consumption and promote the use of more efficient technologies. In addition to these specific policies, governance more broadly plays a critical role in addressing climate change. International cooperation and coordination is necessary to effectively address the global nature of climate change. The Paris Agreement, signed in 2015, is an international agreement aimed at keeping global warming below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels and pursuing efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The Paris Agreement includes commitments from countries around the world to reduce their greenhouse